to Migrating to AWS Pitfalls and Tips. In this presentation, we will go over the process of migrating an existing solution to AWS and a number of the things that you may come across that might cause issues, and provide you with some tips on ways to make your migration smoother and things you may come across in your migration journey. And just a quick bit about myself. I'm the Professional Services Team Lead at CloudEndure. We're an AWS Advanced Partner with the Education and DevOps competencies. And we help a lot of companies, whether they're moving to AWS for the first time or they have an existing AWS solution where they want new features or want to make it more optimized. I hold a number of AWS certificates, including the SA and DevOps Pro certificates. And I've also put some details here about my own sort of personal Twitter account and blog where I talk about AWS and general technology quite a lot. So you may be wondering why you might to move to AWS, whether you're at the start of your journey or you've already decided. I've put some tips here about why you might want to move there. So generally in AWS, you're paying for what you use. So it's very different from the on-premise model where you're locked into long contracts and you can't really change. So with AWS, you're moving from a capital expenditure module where you pay everything up front, or you pay for long-term usage, to an operating expense module where you're paying every month. And with AWS, you get a lot of new technologies such as serverless. Generally, AWS release quite a number of products. So every week they release new products and features, and we do a weekly news update with sort of 10 to 20 new features or new announcements every week. And especially around reInvent, they will release hundreds or thousands of new features. And it can be quite a challenge to keep up with a lot of that, but there's a lot of good technology that you can use there. And generally, AWS supports the products quite well. So from what I've seen, all the products that they've launched since 2006, when they launched was S3, they haven't really stopped supporting a product, and they generally make it better as time goes on. And as I mentioned, you have no long-term contracts with AWS, so it's up to you when you want to stop using AWS, and if you want to move somewhere else, you're not locked into that long-term contract. And again, they have hundreds of products and services for almost every use case. So in terms of on-premise, some of these you may have already come across. This may be challenges that you're already facing and why you want to move to AWS. So with the on-premise model of contracts and renting particular machines, etc., some of the things that you may come across are things like long-term contract commitments. It means you're stuck with what you've bought for a year, 18 months or more, and you're locked into what you thought you needed at the time when you signed the contract. So if your business changes, or for example, during the pandemic, people's traffic may have increased or decreased, depending on how online they are. With an on-premise model, you're stuck with what you have. You can't really expand on it in a rapid way. Whereas with cloud computing, you can add capacity as you need it, or remove capacity. And that means that you can adapt to change. So to mention, the pandemic means that a lot of companies that are online-based, like education providers, where they need to move from the classroom to online, have had to rapidly change their operating models to allow for that extra scale, and usually in quite a rapid time scale. In some cases with on-premise, you may actually be operating on outdated hardware as well. So what was good 18 months ago is probably sort of middle of the road, or even not very good now, just because of the rate of change of computing. And in on-premise, you generally have a lack of control in a lot of cases where, so example of this is where you might want to open a new port. You have to go through like a change control process, or you have to essentially ask for permission before you're able to do that. With AWS, you get a lot more of that control. And just in the next section here, I'm going to cover some of the services that will help with a migration to AWS. So first two I'm going to cover the CloudEndure and also the application migration service, which is Amazon's version of CloudEndure, but in the console and sort of more integrated. So CloudEndure was a company that Amazon bought a number of years ago that allowed for an agent to be installed on a server to do sort of block level copying of data over to AWS for backup purposes and migration purposes. So it allows you to essentially copy a server block by block and have an exact copy of that on AWS. The Migration Hub is generally a place where all of your data about what you're going to migrate through different agents that you've collected will be stored, and you can run reports there and figure out what you actually have. The Application Discovery Service is it's an agent that will run on your machine and allow you to figure out what you actually have running. So this will figure out all the background processes that are running that haven't been changed in years, and also your actual application and how it's communicating with everything. AWS Data Sync is a virtual machine that you can attach to a network attached storage that allows you to copy data from those types of storage over to AWS without really having to interact with it that much. The Server Migration Service is for moving a full virtual machine over. So you can take a VMware virtual machine and actually migrate that over into an EC2 instance. And the Database Migration Service is where you have an on-premise database and it allows you to copy the data over row by row, and it also allows you to change the schema of databases, and it even allows you to change from one database type to another. So in terms of actually doing a migration, the people talk about the 6 R's, which are the main methods of migration. AWS sometimes refer to a 7th as well. And the 6 R's that we're talking about here are retire, retain, rehost, replatform, repurchase, or refactor. And I'll go into those in a second. The 7th one Amazon talks about is relocate, which is moving from VMware Cloud essentially to AWS's VMware Cloud. So you're essentially moving the whole virtual machine over to AWS without really any other changes. So in my view, that's a specialization of replatform. It's not really, it's its own thing, but AWS do like to call that one out. So in terms of the 6 R's, the first two, retire and retain, are where you're either going to stop using a part of your platform and actually just turn it off completely. So that's where something's used by a small amount of customers or it's out of date and you don't need it anymore. And retain is where you're going to actually keep it on premise and not move it to AWS. So they are generally out of scope of the rest of the migration. Rehosting is the sort of most common one. It's also referred to as lift and shift. And that's where you're moving your application and data into AWS without really changing the architecture. So you may be moving from, for example, an on-premise VM to an EC2 instance, all the same software, and it runs pretty much the same. Replatforming is where you're essentially doing a lot of the same things as rehosting, but you're changing where it's actually going to be hosted. So an example of that might be moving an on-premise database over to RDS. So you're changing the service, but the underlying how it works is still the same. Repurchasing is where you are maybe taking an existing part of your platform and replacing it with something else, like a SaaS product, such as MailChimp, as a replacement for SMTP and SendMail, for example. And refactoring is one of the sort of more complicated ones, where that's actually changing how your application works and changing the architecture of it. So that includes things like moving to a serverless solution, or just even splitting up your application, moving into containers and having a microservice type application. That's usually the end goal of a lot of migrations, but not where people start. People usually like to get onto AWS first and then start considering refactoring. And one of the biggest tips I can give in a migration is just to document everything, especially during the migration and planning phase. So when you're going through those phases, the more that you can document up front, the better your migration will be. And this is of particular use in a lot of the cases that we've came across. So for example, we had a sort of 20-year-old application that had been built up, and over time different people had worked on it, large teams, and it was fairly monolithic, but because of the nature of on-premise, a lot of the background code that was running on whatever server it could fit on. There was stuff that had been running for years that nobody had ever needed to touch since it was originally deployed, because it just worked. And finding all those different things that are running and how they interact with each other, and all the different, in this example, all the different network storage that was available, was key to the success of the migration, because unless you know what you're going to migrate, you're going to miss stuff, and it will delay your migration. And that's usually where we find the issues in migration. It's not caused by what you're migrating, it's where you've missed something, or you've missed a connection that your application needs, whether that's to a third party or a background process that needs to be refactored in some way to work on your new platform. So just a bit more detail with the discovery phase. Once you've actually got all the details, some of the things that you might find is you might find code that's been written by people who have left the business, one-off purpose code, so something that was written to solve a customer problem that is run in the background and only the person who wrote it knows about it. You may have no documentation or very light documentation. You may also have processes running machines wherever that you can fit. As I mentioned in the example, the 20-year-old application had loads of stuff over every server that it could fit on, just to actually get these processes running, because having them on centralized machines wasn't really feasible because of the amount of them. You may have customer specific code that, again, you might not actually need this anymore. They may have written code for a customer that's no longer with you, and you may have older hardware. So a lot of these are based on the on-premise restrictions, but you need to know about all of this in the actual discovery phase. So you may also have code that interacts with providers or even internal and specific ports, and you need to note that down, because that will become important when you're designing your solution. And you need to make sure you're taking note of any fixed hardware or fixed IP addresses that you're currently communicating with, because you'll need to have a plan for how to deal with that. And before you actually migrate, it's useful to actually set up your AWS account in a good way. Rather than just using a single account, generally what we would advise is use multiple accounts in an organizational structure. That gives you centralized billing, but it also allows you to have separate dev, stage, prod, test accounts for each of your workloads. And that allows separation of concerns, so you can make sure that the only people that can access it are people who need to access it. We also recommend using cross-account roles for access, so that rather than having users in every account, you have one centralized set of users and they have access to the other accounts. Setting up a centralized login and centralized security accounts is usually a good idea. Again, that separation of concerns, and have your team that deals with the security and the debugging, having that away from people who don't need to see that. So you may have your developers in one account, your production support teams in a different account, for example. And we always recommend using least privilege access, where you only give users the access that they need to do the role that they're doing. Generally, during migration, you might give them more access so that they can help out and change your architecture as needed, but once you're actually up and running, you lock it down to only what they actually need. And IAM Access Analyzer is usually quite a good tool for figuring out what people are actually using. And so in terms of CloudEndure is a tool for actually moving, as I mentioned, block storage, or moving block by block system over to AWS. You install an agent and then it communicates on port 443 with CloudEndure, but then the actual replication happens over port 1500, and it uses a replication server to copy all the data over, and you end up with a target server on AWS as an EC2 instance that you can then launch into production. But there's some things that you should be watching out for when you're using CloudEndure. So these are some of the things that we've came across. Generally, the use of a direct connect is recommended, or at least a VPN, just to keep the connection secure, but also have a dedicated line. The quicker you can get port 443 and 1500 open on your on-premise means the quicker you can actually get the CloudEndure communicating properly. Generally, multiple network interfaces aren't supported, or you at least have issues with it. We have had some success with installing the enhanced networking adapter drivers on on-premise hardware, because we had issues where without those drivers, the target machine wouldn't boot because it didn't know how to actually connect to the internet or to connect to the local VPC. So CloudEndure does block level copying, so for server attached, for SANs, as long as they're actually represented on the machine as a block device, it will get copied as if it was a local drive. But for network file shares, you should use something like the data sync or install the CloudEndure agent directly on the server where that's possible. We have had issues in the past where EC2 for Windows machines only have up to 2 terabytes as the root drive, even if the source machine actually has more. So I know 2 terabytes is quite a lot, but it's something we have actually hit. The replication only also supports GPT, so it's GUID partition table, and as long as they're if they're dynamic, it means you can't get them on as boot devices. We've came across issues with UEFI booting. CloudEndure does have an option for that, so it's just making sure that's ticked if you are using UEFI boots. The one thing to watch out for CloudEndure as well is in the replication settings, it does default to provisioned IOPS for some reason, and that can be very expensive if you don't catch that. Generally, it's useful to move it down to GP2. And if you've got a virtual machine running on your on-premise hardware, that generally needs to be removed first, including any Hyper-V extensions, because that will stop the machine from booting as well. And as I mentioned before, any hard-coded IP addresses need to be removed. So once you've actually created a plan and you're ready to migrate, depending on what you're actually migrating and how complex it is, you can use a single day to migrate everything over, or move different parts of the application at different times. But there are also different things that you can do while migrating that will make things a bit easier. So following the plan that you've set out is generally a good idea, and making sure that you've ticked off all the steps that you're doing and you're not skipping anything unless it's a really good reason that you've identified an issue with it. As I mentioned before, documenting everything will make this process a lot easier. So once you actually have all the details of what you're going to migrate, and when you come to do the migration, following what you've already identified will run things a lot smoother. For the people that are actually involved in the process of doing the migration, make sure that everybody's kept informed, whether that's stakeholders or the actual people doing the migration. Generally, something like a meetup every so often, and video conferencing, or having people physically in the same place, and keeping stakeholders up to date is usually a good idea, just to make sure everybody's on the same page of what's been done, what's not been done, what's still to be done. And communicating, as I mentioned, is a really key thing. So make sure you don't have one person going away and doing one part of the plan and everybody else thinks somebody else is doing it. You end up with duplication and confusion, or things not done in the right order. And if you do have to fix something that comes up during the migration phase, which is usually quite likely, you'll find something that doesn't quite work the way you thought it did when you actually move it over, or you'll find something else during the migration phase that was potentially missed during the discovery phase. You can fix it during the migration, but make sure that you're doing it in such a way that it's documented and it's repeatable later on, so that you just don't end up with all these fixes that are done during the migration, that if there's ever an issue with them that come up at the end, you don't know what to do with them because it was done during the migration and it wasn't properly documented. And then after your actual migration, then congratulations, you're migrated to AWS. So you've done a difficult task, but there's steps that you now need to do. You can concentrate on actually running the workload on AWS, and this is where you start doing your optimization and refactoring and making things better and taking advantage of all the different services that AWS have, and generally adding new features to your application or making it more cost efficient, etc. And once you've actually started to do that, then, and once you're settled down and you're in the groove of actually running your new application, you can then start splitting it up and doing refactoring. You might run a pilot workload on serverless, for example, and do more cloud native applications and workloads. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that and come up with some good use cases, and I wish you all success in any migrations that you do.
Thanks for that insight, John, who is in fact right now joining me live, not from Singapore or from a different time zone, but part of Scotland. Whereabouts are you in Scotland?
I'm in Glasgow, John, so thanks for having me. I'm in the chat as who's this on?
Gotcha. So. Right. Now I put two and two together. Like now I know who I was talking to. Great stuff. Yeah, good city, Glasgow. I've enjoyed weekends up there. So I guess the one thing that I could say we have in common is that you're an AWS APN ambassador. I would usually have some Ferrero Rocher to kind of wave around to celebrate that, but I ate them all last time, so decided that probably wasn't the best bet. But you're fairly recent to the ambassador program, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I just joined a couple of weeks ago now, I think. The process was actually quite quick for me as well. I think it was only like a week or two and actually joining that, because I had a bunch of stuff actually that I'd done over the last year as the sort of prerequisites for it. So yeah, it's been good so far. I actually really enjoyed it.
Great stuff. Yeah, for those of you on the stream who are unfamiliar with the program, the APN ambassadors are people like myself and like John who are fairly regularly giving back into the community with sort of talks and blog posts and so forth, and so they kind of they recognise us in a I guess we get sort of information that isn't generally available. We get to chat to people from the product teams. There are some reInvent benefits, assuming that goes ahead this year, which I believe is planned. But you'll hear, no doubt, if you follow John on Twitter, you'll see more of his ambassadorial outputs. Blogging seems to be your thing, is that right, John?
Yeah, mostly blogging and these types of webinars. I co-run the AWS Edinburgh user group, and we've also just taken over the DevOps Edinburgh user group, and we've got some talks coming up for that as well. So yeah, blogging and the webinars are kind of my two things.
Gotcha. So we've got a few people on the feed this evening who are definitely interested in doing their SA associate, and I guess the what you've just talked about in terms of migration is actually partly content that is on that exam, right? You want to talk briefly about, I guess, maybe your experience of going for that exam and what sort of things it was useful to know for the benefit of people who are going to be doing that.
Yeah, definitely. The essay associate has been a while since I've done it now, so I've still got about another year or so on it before that renews. But yeah, a lot of what we've talked about there and how you migrate, and actually just knowing how you run things on AWS and actually how things are designed and all the different services that you can use is really important. One of just as a sort of more general tip for exams, when I've been doing the exams, I've been using a lot of the like Cloud Guru, who are now I can't remember who's now bought them.
Plural sites. As of like, I think that purchase happened on the day of our last meetup. It was like announced that morning, I think.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I've been using that, and a lot of the specific exams on Udemy as well. One of the biggest things I found is actually the practice exams on Udemy, and actually being able to take those sort of over and over again and see where I was actually needing the extra help, and then once I've kind of identified the area that I'm slightly weaker on, going into the reInvent videos with the deep dives, like the 300 and 400 level talks, and actually drilling down much more into that side of things and actually getting more detail there. Sometimes with those you might end up getting a bit more information than you need for the associate exam, but it'll always help you in the future if you decide to go for the SA Pro. So there's definitely some good ones on there. There's one I'd really recommend. There's an IAM deep dive video that explains the sort of process behind IAM and the reasoning of it. And that one actually got me understanding service control policies a lot more than I did before it. And so that's definitely a good one. Same with the DynamoDB ones. Their videos are quite good.
Yep, that's very similar to how I go about it as well. Actually, the sort of taking practice exams to highlight the areas that you're weak on, and then sort of going off into the official. I tend to use the white papers quite a bit, as well as the reinvent content. I tend to I absorb information more quickly in written form than I do in video, where I'm sort of sat kind of impatiently speeding it up to get to the meat.
I think I listen to all the videos in 1.5 speed and just kind of take it in that way.
Yeah. I didn't meet, but I saw Ryan Kroonenberg from A Cloud Guru at the AWS Summit in London a couple of years ago, and was amused and surprised to find that I was expecting him to talk faster because I'd been watching all of his videos on double speed. Cool. So let's talk about migration. Obviously, a chosen specialist subject for you. Is there fundamentally a difference between migrating an existing workload and building something brand new in AWS, and what is that in terms of like the approach and the way you think about design?
Yeah, there's a difference. With both, you are essentially going to be building out the architecture anyway. So with something brand new and something on premise, you may have EC2 instances, for example, and VPCs, etc. But the biggest thing with migration is that you're going to have the existing application there, and it's going to be set up to be working on the on-premise side. So it's going to have all specific setup for like how to get out to the internet, all the different ports, anything that you would actually need it to run on there. And you're going to need to figure out what all of that setup is before you can migrate it. So with doing something brand new on AWS, you may be, say, for example, you're doing like a LAMP stack, you're going to be installing the packages, getting the setup and putting your config on there. But when you're migrating, you're going to have a lot of that already. So you need to actually figure out what's going to work, what's up, where are the blockers going to be on this, how do you actually adapt my application on AWS. In a lot of cases, because it is virtual machines, and if you're doing a like for like, a lot of it will just work. But there's always going to be something that'll come out of the woodwork that you'll not realise, and you'll need to try and find a workaround for. And that's why documenting everything and actually doing testing on it before you go into production to find those issues is key. Yeah,
I was struck by your emphasis on documentation. I think it's the sort of thing that I think a lot of people in tech don't have a good leaning towards. Is that something that you've always had, or was it, is that a hard one through experience?
Yeah, definitely the latter. My background as a programmer, and generally is in IT. I've never really liked writing documentation, but I know the value of it, especially like 6 months, a year later, when it's not all in your head because you've moved on to something else. Actually writing something down can save you so much time later on to try and figure it out from sort of first principles again. And especially in migrations, the more that we've documented, the easier the process has been. It's just that extra. Even if it's like, if you spend a couple of days just writing documentation, even if you think you know it, spending that extra time will save you so much time down the line. Yeah, and I like the fact that you're also talking about making a plan, but then also making sure that you stick to the plan when you go to do the thing itself. Easy to sort of get off track a little bit, I think, isn't it, when you're doing that sort of thing? Definitely, yeah. The temptation's definitely there to just go away and do the new thing that you want to do, or to get something up and running. But if you don't do everything that you said you were going to do, it's just going to bite you later on. Yeah, cool. Just as an aside, I'm whilst we're talking, I'm keeping half an eye on my other laptop because I'm waiting for the raffle winners to arrive in the slide deck. So I'm going to fill until they do. We might be chatting for a little while while Paul's sorting that out. The CloudEndure is a tool I haven't really come across as anything other than, I guess, a thing that's mentioned in the exam content. I'm a bit more familiar with things like storage gateway and that sort of stuff. Is there sort of overlap with that method? There's an overlap in what you can do. CloudEndure essentially is, I think it started off as like a backup product, so a way of actually taking a virtual machine with attached storage and actually backing that up to an EC2 instance so you could run it there if you needed to. And then it started to be used for migration. So it's essentially just the agent running in the background, and it'll copy at a block level everything that's on the drive exactly as it is. So you end up with like a snapshot there. There are other tools, so like you can use the VM import. For example, if you've managed to get a VMware image of the server, and that'll do essentially the same thing, but it won't have that continuous replication. And to mention, you can use things like data sync to actually transfer network file storage across. So there is definitely a lot of overlap, and usually finding the right tool for what type of instance you're actually going to be moving over is quite key. I think in some of the migrations we've done, usually CloudEndure was the first one that we tried, but every time we would come up against an issue, we'd try and figure out something else to do it. So some of the examples are like not being able to open that port 1500. That means the replication just won't work at all. So in those instances, having to get an image of the machine itself, upload that to S3, and then create an EC2 instance from that. That was kind of our way around it. But yeah, there's definitely overlap between all the different services.
And is the replication going in CloudEndure, is that sort of continuous in the same way that DMS is for databases, where as you're working on that machine, it's updating the changed blocks so that you can more easily switch over in the final kind of cutover?
Yeah, it was exactly the same. Yeah, there's an initial period where it does the initial replication, and then it goes into continuous replication mode. So depending on the server, sometimes that initial replication can take a while. I think the longest we had was about a week, but that was for a server that had like 16 terabytes of storage attached to it.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, it's a lot of storage to be moving around.
Yeah. That was the same server where we had the limit on the boot drive being 2 terabytes, which isn't really a CloudEndure limit. It's actually an EC2 limit that we found out. But yeah, it's the first time I came across that one, because it's the first time I moved a machine that's had 2 terabytes on its initial drive. Yeah,
it's pretty involved. So there's a question from the chat. It's Ijaz, who's one of the organisers, who I literally haven't seen for months. Hello, Ijaz. Ijaz asks, many applications are developed or managed by third parties. How do you optimise or refactor those after a lift and shift?
Yeah, so one of the best things I can actually say is probably to try and get the third party involved if it's possible, just to get that information of what is actually there. When you do a CloudEndure migration, it will copy the system exactly as it is. So to actually make sure that the third-party application is working, you need to make sure that the AWS side of it has all the security groups open, it has all the route to the internet if it's required, and actually have that application be able to run in the same way as it does in the original side. But as it's going to be a block level migration, so it's doing exactly what's on the disk, it should essentially just run as is on the machine. It's just the external stuff to that, like the internet access and the ports that you would need to worry about in that case. But yeah, the more you can get the third party involved to sort of describe exactly what they've done and how it interacts with the outside world, the easier that process is going to be.
Yeah, because I guess over time there are things like you might want to take, I don't know, secrets that were baked into config files on those machines and put them in secrets manager or parameter store or something. And I guess at that point you're going to need to crack open the app and start making some changes. So you might need the original authors around to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And it depends on how much you want to actually be able to dig into that. You may need to interact with the third party to say, this is what we want to do and here's how you would store it in Secrets Manager, and actually give them the code and then give them access to be able to do that. So yeah, it's talking with them and figuring that out. So that side of it is another one thing I just wanted to mention. Is although when I mentioned the sort of 6 R's and the different ways of migrating, you're choosing them for each individual sort of part of your application that you're moving across. But what I would say is that if there are any sort of low-hanging fruit or things that you can change while you're doing that migration, it's usually quite useful to do them before you cut over. So one of the examples in the application I was talking about, we had a set of servers that were using like a sort of master-slave process for doing worker tasks, and they were running on a set of, say, 10, 15 physical servers, and all of them were identical in terms of the software that was installed. So while we did the migration, we did a lift and shift to one machine, then created an image of that and made it an auto-scaling group. So we ended up getting that scalability benefit without really having to change anything about the application itself, other than there was a script that ran every time there was a scale out event to add the new server's IP address into the server, so that it knew where that worker server was. So getting that benefit there for very little change is a good thing to do during the migration.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Cool, great stuff. Final question for you then, John. We've got reInvent later in the year. I don't know if you're going to be able to make that as an ambassador and take advantage of the reserved seating at the front, and that way you can throw vegetables at Werner if you feel like it. What's on your wish list for reInvent this year? What's the thing you're missing?
Yeah, so probably some cloud formation improvements. Really, that's probably the one thing that actually. So I interact with every day. There have been some recent ones in system manager and version control and everything, but one of the things that irritates me is when you have a large CloudFormation stack with multiple substacks that takes quite a while. So say, for example, there's a restore a database step. Getting to the end of that, you've maybe sat there for half an hour, and there been a bug in one of the substacks, and then it rolls the entire thing all the way back. I wish there was a better way of doing that. It would save me so much time. The other thing I'd actually quite like is like an architecture diagram program. So something like, I know you have programs like Lucidchart where you can hook it up to your AWS account and it'll spider through and figure out what's there. But something that's more AWS native that you could actually say, here's all the things that actually work together. Kind of in the way they do for like microservices. We have the graph or through X-Ray, but something I should just say is like, here's all the VPCs, the security groups, NAT gateways, and here's how everything actually links together. So you can actually then drill down and say, okay, well, the issue is going to be somewhere in here. Like maybe a VPC peering connection you're having to look into. Something that would make that process a bit easier, and just being able to say, here's actually what I have in terms of architecture without having to spend hours going away and actually diagramming it all yourself, because then you might diagram your infrastructure when you first create it, but then as you go along, you might add things and not update the diagram, and then it's out of date. So something where you could automate that side of things would be really useful. Yeah,
I'm sort of picturing a Minority Report style kind of big old console that you're kind of diving around data. Be pretty cool.
Yeah.
I actually have one more question from the chat. The Luke Rogerson, who apparently has the definite article at the beginning of his name. The Luke Rogerson says, ever done another cloud provider migration to AWS from, for example, Azure or GCP? What complications might come up there?
Yeah. Funnily enough, we're actually in the middle of, well, we've not quite started the migration, but we're in the discovery phase of an Azure to AWS migration. And we've already come up across some issues on that one. So one of the biggest things is actually figuring out how the services map together. Because with AWS and Azure, there are similarities in some of it, but some of the fundamental ways that AWS works are different from Azure. So, for example, Azure has the subscription concept where you can tie everything together based on a particular subscription, and you can restrict access to that. And when you go to the AWS world, you don't really have that within an account. And I think the best ways of doing it is actually just doing a separate account for that. But there are other tools that I think Azure has a lot of tools around the security thing that Azure, that AWS doesn't really have. A lot of the sort of the intrusion detection stuff is a lot better on Azure, and the threat detection. So try to find a replacement for that. And there's one of the things, a just-in-time access policy, where you can say you can grant access for an hour to a particular machine, and it will automatically expire. So I think AWS has the tools to do that with like the token service, but it's one of these things that's the builder paradigm from AWS, where they'll give you all the tools to do exactly what you need, but you might need to actually build it together yourself to sort of chain these applications together to be able to do something. So yeah, that's kind of the main challenge, I think, is just figuring out what's there on Azure and how to map that to AWS and where the gaps are.
Yep.
And also where AWS can do things better, because you might be able to refactor some of the ways of doing things on Azure to do it in the AWS style of doing things that may be quicker or less complicated.
Yeah, we're doing some work at the moment with a well-known security vendor who have a large GCP estate, and we're working on migrating that over to AWS. And I think that the main thing is that because it's another cloud vendor, there's already a level of cloud native thinking involved. So they are thinking in terms of containers and orchestrators, and the security groups and whatever the Google equivalent of those things are. So there isn't quite as much rethinking about design, but as you say, it's sort of mapping, looking for equivalents, and sort of trying to replace the things that other cloud vendor does well with components that suit the target environment. So it's I guess no less challenging necessarily to do that kind of migration, but the challenges are a little bit different looking.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining, John. It transpires that we don't have raffle winners this evening, so I'm just going to carry on. But it's been great chatting with you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Hopefully I'll bump into you in person at something ambassadorial in the near future. Thanks for dialing in. Yeah. Thanks, John.
Yeah, great, and thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thanks very much.